Good afternoon. Sorry. Good afternoon. I'm John Tomasi on behalf of the Political Theory Project. Welcome to this afternoon's event. My friends at other universities often tease me about Brown. They say that at Brown, we don't deserve the students that we get. And they have reasons for thinking this is true about us at Brown. Harvard's endowment is something like $25 billion. Brown's endowment is 2.3 soaking wet. Princeton has something like, it's hard to count on their website because it's kind of complicated, but Princeton has something like 12 Nobel laureates. Brown has one Nobel laureate, and he's getting old. Stanford stretches across 8,143 sun-soaked acres in Silicon Valley, each inch worth, serious money. Brown has 14.2 acres sort of sandwiched around pizza parlors and other kinds of places like that. And yet, despite those differences between Brown and Stanford and Princeton and other places like that, and yet, despite those differences, every year Brown competes for the very best students in the country and from around the world. Why does this happen? I think there's a certain magic about Brown that lies in this feature of Brown, and the feature is that at Brown, more than at those other places, we tend to give authority to our students to make this place the place that they want it to be. And the most obvious example of that is the new curriculum, where we actually say to the students, each of them, you decide what kind of education is worthy of you and pursue it. Another smaller sign of that is the Political Theory Project, and especially the Janus Forum. And with the Janus Forum, a group of Brown students choose topics, they choose speakers, they devise the event that you'll be experiencing this afternoon. And in keeping with the spirit of staying out of the students' way and letting them do the things that they do, I'm going to now leave the stage to Andrea Matthews, who's the director of the Janus Forum. Please.
Thanks, guys. I'm Andrea. I'm the executive director of the Janus Forum, and I want to thank you for coming to our lecture, Access and Authority is the Internet a Democratizing Technology. We're joined today by two fantastic scholars, so I'm going to keep my introduction really short. I just wanted to thank anyone who's new to Janus who came out today. If this is your first time coming to one of our events, welcome. We're glad you've joined us, and we hope to see you again in the future. For those of you who are new, the Janus Forum is a student group that tries to elevate the level of discussion about political and social ideas at Brown. We do this by putting on events like this one, where we encourage students to voice their views, listen to other people's opinions, and engage in an open and well-rounded conversation. In addition to this lecture series, we host about one event per week, or if it's this week, 3 events in 1 week. And those events are conversations with Brown professors, student debates, or even just free lunches where students can come together and discuss political ideas. Everyone's always welcome to join us, grab some food, and join the conversation. And before I forget, we have an event coming next Thursday, October 28th, on the politics of organ trafficking with Professor Sharon Hamdi at 7 p.m. in Wilson 205, if anyone's interested. And I wanted to take a moment to thank the Political Theory Project for all their generosity. Without their support, the Janus Forum wouldn't be able to do what we do. But I want to let you in on a little Janus secret. When we were recruiting speakers for this year's lecture series, we had a lot of difficulty getting one of them to call us back. We couldn't figure out if they were actually going to come. So we tried calling and we tried emailing, and nothing was working. And finally, in a last-ditch attempt, one of our executive board members went on Twitter and tweeted about it. And sure enough, the speaker got back to us within 1 hour of that tweet. And the whole executive board, which as a body is very skeptical of Twitter, said, who knew that Twitter was so powerful? Well, the power of Twitter, websites like YouTube, and the internet in general is exactly what our speakers are here to discuss today. Specifically, they're here to help us determine the answer to the question of whether the internet can actually have a democratizing effect, whether it can help topple authoritarian regimes and foster more democratic forms of government. Through the highly politicized process of alphabetical order, Mr. Evgeny Morozov will speak first. Mr. Morozov is the author of The Net Delusion, The Dark Side of Internet Freedom. He's a contributing editor to Foreign Policy and currently a visiting scholar at Stanford University. And he will be followed by Mr. Clay Shirky, the author of Here Comes Everybody, The Power of Organizing Without Organizations. And he is an adjunct professor at NYU's Interactive Telecommunications program, and he divides his time between consulting, teaching, and writing on the social and economic effects of internet technologies. Each of our speakers will have 25 minutes to present his thoughts, and when they're finished, they will open the floor to you to ask them any question that you want. We would encourage you to please line up at the microphone and ask a question. We have something that we call the Hardball Award, which will go to the asker of the most, what shall we say, premise-undermining question. And if you wish to be eligible for that award, we ask that you give your first and your last name before you speak. Now, the flip side to the Hardball Award is that if you ask a particularly egregiously, soft-handed question, we will give you the Softball Award, and no one wants the Softball Award, so please, be aggressive. Well, so you've heard more than enough from me. Please join me in welcoming our first speaker, Evgeny Morozov.
Thank you so much, and thanks so much for inviting me. As someone who is now based at Stanford and who doesn't drive, actually I appreciate the smallness of your campus. It's actually nice to be somewhere where you can actually walk and reach all the destinations for a chance. So I will start immediately on my first site with a little bit of history trivia, Cold War history trivia, which I think is appropriate given my accent and my last name. So this clunky machine is what Stasi, the East German intelligence service, used to use back in the 70s and the 80s to basically reseal the envelopes of letters that they've read. That's how it was all done before the age of email and tweets and Facebook. You actually had to go and spend some physical energy resealing all the correspondence. So let me start with a very provocative statement that the internet is really simple. There is nothing unique about it. You can understand it very easily. There is nothing sophisticated about it as a technology. In fact, the good news for those of you looking for jobs in this audience is that it's very easy to be an internet guru. You don't need a PhD. Actually, neither me nor Clay Shirky here have one. It's very easy to be an internet guru. Why? Because the internet is very simple, right? And it all more or less boils down to a few very simple laws. You get more connectivity for less money, right? For less expensive spend. So you get more nodes and connections who can now connect to each other, who can connect to more information. And all of that is happening very cheap, and all of that is happening also very fast. And I think none other than Clay Shirky actually documented all of that very well in his 2 books. Again, it's very simple. There is nothing sophisticated about the impact of the internet. However, I think the implications of those 2 laws that I've just shown, those 2 very basic laws about the number of connections and the ease of access to information, the implications are much harder to understand. And in part because you need to understand more than just the internet to understand the implications. So, if the question that we are trying to answer today, whether the internet is a democratizing technology, it is, because it does democratize access to platforms of information sharing and mobilization. As you all know, each of you can go on Facebook or Twitter, start a group, start posting messages. All of that is easy, and you know that that would be much harder to do 10 or 20 years ago. All of that is pretty obvious. However, I think what you need to understand is that democratization of access to technology and to information does not by itself imply or automatically lead to any kind of democratization of society, right? The pictures that you see in the background of this slide is actually an explosive device which is detonated by a mobile call or an SMS, and those were very popular in Iraq. Again, you have to look a little bit further than just looking at whether it is cheaper to get access to technology or to information, in part because tweeting extremist group is not necessarily a sign of greater democratization, right? So this is something that we all have to keep in mind. So, the first observation I would like to make today is that yes, the logic of the internet, what I've just shown you, the falling costs of access and the falling costs of mobilization, yes, it will amplify all the actors and all the social processes, right? But it will amplify all actors, not just those that favor democratization, right? And the second observation I would like to make is that while it will amplify all those forces that are at play in a given society, it's very hard for us to say how the relative distribution of power within those forces and within those particular sectors, how it will change. So, I just drew, I thought any PowerPoint should have some pie charts in it. So, I just inserted those two charts I made myself in Excel just to communicate the basic idea that, if you start on the basic premise that, there are three actors or three forces shaping up a society before the internet, and you, so to say, introduce the internet into it, well, the distribution may change. You may get many more actors, and some of them apparently may become more powerful, some may become less, there may be new players, there may be fewer players, right? Again, this is something that you have to investigate sort of outside of this logic of the internet. The fact that the costs are falling and that the access to information is becoming cheaper doesn't tell us anything about the distribution of power within a given society. So the bigger point I'm trying to make is that unless you see the big picture before the internet, you will not see the big picture after the internet, right? You do have to get a much finer understanding of how democratic societies work, of how authoritarian societies work, before you start analyzing how technology will affect each of the forces that are at play in those societies, right? So my second pie chart, and that's the last one in this PowerPoint, which of those two pie charts you think is more reflective of how a complex society like Russia or China or Iran operates? If you start with a very basic premise that there is the government and then there is the opposition, and the opposition is all one color, they're all pro-Western and they're all pro-democratic, you end up with a very simplistic pie chart, and then you try to analyze how the internet will modify and amplify each of those two forces. If, however, you draw on a slightly more sophisticated picture and you start figuring in forces like religion, like nationalism, like opposition, which is not necessarily democratic, you end up with a pie chart which is much more complex, and once you introduce the internet, it gets even more complex, right? So this is the key, I think, point to keep in mind. So the limitation of the digital outlook, sort of that many of us who call themselves by necessity or by choice digital gurus, the limitation of this discourse is that our ability to understand the internet and its sort of impact on the world is only as good as our understanding of the world itself. Right? That's kind of a very, I think, Kantian categorical point, but I think it's very important to make it. Because what we end up with is we start with very simple theories about how democracies, how authoritarian regimes function, and we multiply them by very simple theories about the internet, and eventually we end up in a very wrong place, right? So the key takeaway for you, again, is that if you do want to understand how the internet works, don't become an internet guru, go and get a PhD in something non-digital. right? Because the focus of your analysis should be not on the internet, but on the societies that it wants to transform, and that you want to understand how it is transforming. So the reason why there is so much what I call cyber enthusiasm right now in Washington and in other places about the ability of the internet to transform places like China, places like Iran, places like even North Korea, is because the assumptions about how those countries work and how those regimes work in the media and in kind of popular public discourse, they're very shallow and they're very simplistic. Right? Most people start with a very simple model. And here I'm will try to outline what that simple model looks like. Right? So the state that didn't survive the web, right? It's the kind of the dream model of a state that can be toppled by tweets and Facebook messages and pokes and whatever else you call it. So of course, if you start with two actors, you have the very weak and unpopular government, call it the Iranians or the Russian or the Chinese government on the one side, and you have a relatively strong popular opposition on the other side. You have the government which is very ignorant about technology, which doesn't want to use it, and which basically runs away from it, playing versus the guys who are actually all digitally savvy, who know Twitter, who know Facebook, who all work for the opposition. And if you start with that setup, and if you start with the premise that the reason why people have not rebelled yet is because they don't realize that they are living in one big lie promoted by the government, then of course once you introduce the internet, you can as well reason that people will go to Google, discover all the truth about what happened in the last 50 or 20 or 30 decades, and then they will use Facebook to self-mobilize and pour into the streets and topple the government. Right? So if you start with all of those premises, of course, it's almost inevitable that you end up concluding that some kind of a Twitter revolution is inevitable, right? Because why wouldn't it happen? Everything seems to be in the right place. The problem is that if you start making this model a little bit more sophisticated, and you start introducing more actors, and you start introducing more relationships, as I've said, whether it's trying to think how will different anti-democratic non-state groups, like nationalists, for example, or people who are on the extreme right or on the extreme left in Russia, and there are many of those groups, which I'm not sure they're actually much more democratic than the Kremlin, right? How they will figure in and how they will profit from the internet. If you start trying to understand how the internet in the longer term will reshape phenomena like nationalism or religion, or how it will affect consumerism in many of those countries, which have more or less all now accepted globalization, have accepted Americanization even, and have accepted all the consumer goods that we are enjoying in the West. I mean, if you go and look at modern, China or Russia at this point, it's probably fair to say that someone like Steve Jobs commands much more respect than Che Guevara. I mean, those are the new idols, and you have to understand that, consumerism is playing a huge political role, and the internet is playing an important role in enabling that. So you have to understand all of those dynamics if you really want to understand the influence of the internet on the political situation in those countries. So just to pick on one example, if you pick on a country like Russia, and you go beyond sort of typical dichotomy that is often portrayed in the Western press, where there is the Kremlin, which are the bad guys, and then the good guys, the kind of monolithic Russian opposition. It actually starts mapping out all the relationships and all the actors that are currently present in the kind of modern Russian political environment. You have the Kremlin trying to sort of centralize its rule in 89 federal subjects, right? Russian republics, some of whom actually want to break away. So you end up with situations like the Islamist extremists fighting in the North Caucasus, all of whom also are trying to profit from technology, whether it's to distribute the information or whether it's to mobilize groups behind their causes. You end up with nationalists in places like Moscow who want to basically expel all ethnic minorities from the city. They beat up guest workers, they even film how they abuse guest workers and then upload those videos online to intimidate them. Again, you end up with groups that are pursuing all sorts of agendas that may not necessarily be conducive to democratization. You have the opposition, as I've said, some of whom is clearly liberal, but some of whom are also anti-liberal or are pursuing causes that may actually be much worse than those pursued by the Kremlin. And on top of that, you have in the longer term all sorts of social processes. Again, as I've said, consumerism, you also have glorification of the Soviet past and the glorification of Stalin's memory. Much of it also happening online with all sorts of resources being set up to promote that cultural heritage. You have government-led modernization with technology playing an enabling role in it. And it's not at all clear how all of that adds up in terms of technology. You have all sorts of processes. This is Steve Jobs, by the way, if you haven't recognized him without the glasses. We just don't know how all of these complex forces and actors, how they actually end up influencing the situation, even without the internet, right? So once you introduce a technology which breaks down all communication barriers and which does allow easier access to information, you end up in an even more confused state. And it may not sound like good news to those of you who were expecting a very clear answer, but unfortunately, that's what the reality is. I mean, you have now in Russia situations like, for example, there is a nation within Russia called the Circassians. And they have been more or less suppressed by the federal center, by Moscow, for almost 2 centuries. And that suppression was partly made possible because a lot of materials about Circassian history were actually suppressed. You couldn't get alternative interpretations of their history anywhere because those books were banned. Now many of those books published, abroad are being translated, scanned, and put online so that, the Circassian nationalists can actually go and rediscover them and build some sense of national awareness. Again, what way it will push Russia, it's very hard to say because, it may tear it apart. It may lead to some, ethnic conflict. It's very hard to say, but to me, it doesn't look like a very straight relationship that people are empowered and they are asking for change in the Kremlin, because what many of them are asking for has nothing to do with the Kremlin. It has to do with reestablishing their own national identity and seeking independence. So again, you have to root all of these discourses and debates about the internet in the actual political, social, and historical situation in a given country that you're trying to analyze. So what I will do now is that, having made all those preliminary remarks and sort of trying to show you how vast your analysis has to be for you to arrive at any answers, I'll zoom in on one particular piece of that puzzle. I'll zoom in on how authoritarian governments themselves are trying to use the web and how they're trying to profit from it. I'll get back, if I have enough time, to democracies as well, and we'll talk a little bit about democratic cultures, but I do want to spend more time on authoritarian governments because I think there is this perception, and it's actually very strong, that somehow they are technological laggards, that somehow they do not know how to use the internet, and the internet is only undermining their rule, and there is no way that it can strengthen them. And I would like to challenge that assumption because I think we do have to understand how it's transforming them if you want to understand its overall impact. So much of the sort of contemporary debate about the impact of information technology on authoritarian states has been driven by what can be called as Dictators Dilemma. And that dilemma was a dilemma between the need to grow and grow their economies and the need to censor information. So in 1985, George Shultz, who was then the Secretary of State, actually was one of the first Western politicians who articulated that dilemma with regards to the Soviet Union. So his basic point was that, if you are an authoritarian or totalitarian government, you cannot actually grow if you continue to censor. Right, and you can fast forward 25 years later, and Hillary Clinton more or less made the same point in her big internet freedom speech earlier this year, only referring to the internet and not just to information technology like faxes that Schultz referred to when he was talking. There are many politicians. I researched actually this part of the theory very, very heavily when I was working on my book. It occurs almost in every speech given by former Secretary of State. You see it in Baker, you see it in Albright, you see it in Robert Gates. All of these senior politicians in Washington, for some reason, do strongly believe in Dictators Dilemma, that there is no way for these governments to grow until they stop censoring. The problem is that that view misses one of the key points about the internet today. And the key point about the internet today is that it is getting increasingly customized. Everything is getting increasingly customized online. The news you consume is getting customized. The ads you see is getting customized. All of your online experiences are getting customized to serve you in particular. So if you think about ways in which Google and Facebook serves you relevant ads, what they do is that they look at your previous browsing history. They look at your previous history of searches. They look at what it is you're searching for now. They look at your location. They look at what your friends have liked on other sites. And then they make a key decision, what kind of ads to serve you next, based on everything you've been doing before. And as you see, you can easily twist that logic, and instead of serving you ads you might like, you actually may not serve you pages that you might like. Again, it's exactly the same logic. You can actually customize the censorship process to the same kind of degree of, to the same very detailed level that advertising now is customized. And all of the mechanisms are actually already built into the system. So if tomorrow someone like Sergey Brin or Larry Page wake up and they decide that they actually want to do a lot of evil, they'll have the most powerful and profitable censorship technology in the world, because they know so much about you that making the decision whether to censor something will be very easy. Right? And you should also understand where that logic is leading next. Where that logic is leading next is that you will actually be able to separate investment bankers who need to look at Financial Times and Bloomberg News from human rights activists. So investment bankers working in China and Russia will be able to browse anything they want, because the system will know who they are and what their needs are, whereas human rights activists will only be able to government-approved websites on the local internet. Right? And unfortunately, we already see that happening with some systems. If you look at Green Dam, for example, this technology that made a lot of headlines last year that was launched in China, it actually already had some basics of artificial intelligence in it. It was a system that was actually analyzing what you were doing and only then making a decision on whether to block you from visiting a certain page or not. And once you combine artificial intelligence with your social profile and your social graph, you're really talking about powerful systems of censorship, which will be able to separate people into cohorts, and the economists will be able to continue growing, while a very small cluster of people who do care about politics, and oppositional politics in particular, will be prevented from visiting whatever it is that they want to visit. On a similar point, surveillance apparatus of these governments is also getting stronger. You see, and again, this is a feature of the internet society and the digital society we currently live in. Again, we do share more and more data. We do upload more and more of it online, whether it's photos, whether it's our, the news we liked, whether it's something else. And of course, all this publicness, to use a fancy word that is used by many digital right now, it does have certain costs. There was a very interesting, also a very sad case 2 years ago in Belarus, a country where I come from, where one young student activist was actually invited to the dean's office in his university, where he was interviewed by 2 KGB officials who basically found him by browsing the social networking profiles of other oppositional activists. So he got on their radar because he was on someone else's radar, and he was listed as a friend on the Russian social networking site by one of the leaders of the opposition. And if you start thinking about ways in which you can actually data mine all of that and automatically scrap a lot of that data, arrange it in databases, and start mapping relationships, you end up with a very powerful tool. And what's worse, you actually have a lot of private sector companies in the United States that are providing those services, and they're providing those services more or less for business purposes. So they build them for Wall Street. So they build technologies that can pull all sorts of open source data, arrange it into nice clusters, and then you can actually use that data to find out more about people, subjects, whatever. But the same technologies can easily be used to learn more about activists, to learn more about dissidents. What's really troubling me, just to give you a very, I think, sharp example here, is what's now happening in the field of face recognition. So you have more and more social networking sites and more technologies actually, and Google will be one of them very soon, who do allow face recognition features of some kind. So technology may go through, if you teach it once, it may go through your archive of photos that you uploaded to Facebook, and it will identify all your friends just by looking at their photos, because you've identified at the very beginning who your friends are. And you have sites like face.com, you can go and check it out. They've already analyzed something like 50 billion photos, right? And they actually do inscribe metadata on them. What happened in Iran last year was that the government actually went through sites like Flickr, collecting photos that the activists themselves uploaded to the site, and then they collected all those photos and published them on pro-government websites and asked people to identify any faces of the protesters that they can actually recognize. And they managed to identify, by essentially crowdsourcing this, around 40 people, right? And all of that was done manually. If you think about it one step further, what you can do is just to have software do all of that. You'll actually go and compare photos from the street protests to photos that activists themselves are uploading online, right? And again, the implications of that are tremendous. And there are many other disturbing things happening in surveillance. I won't go over them in much detail, but you get all sorts of search engines now which can search for sound and which can search for video. So if you manage to record someone at a protest chanting an anti-government slogan, you can actually then compare that sound with the universe of all sounds that have been uploaded to YouTube. Again, the implications of many of these technologies and the ethical implications are not yet fully understood yet. And while they may allow us, get the best, frappuccino in town because they will customize everything, they'll tell us where our friends are going, they will tell us, what's healthy for us, they may also compromise the security of many people who live in non-democratic societies, right? And again, this will empower authoritarian governments sooner or later. The third part is that, of course, the internet also offers very useful spaces for propaganda, and many governments are very actively taking advantage of them. Whether it's by paying bloggers like the Chinese government does, they actually, train bloggers, they train their own officials in blogging, but you also have centralized projects like happens in Russia, where the government basically outsources all of its propaganda work to a very fancy new media company that is then tasked with producing all sorts of documentaries, building viral buzz around them, and spreading them through those networks. And some of that is actually more believable than just state-owned Russian television, because you know that you should distrust the Russian television. You don't have that feeling about the internet yet. I will fast forward to my last slide here, which I think sums it all very nicely. Again, we cannot understand the impact of the internet just by looking at the internal logic or architecture of the internet. You have to look outside and you have to understand societies and countries that it is meant to shape and reshape. It may seem like a very basic point to social scientists in the room, but the more I talk to people who are working on digital issues, the more I realize that they think that the internet really tells them so much about the rest of the world. They look at its architecture and they think that the architecture of the internet will guarantee that the world is becoming more democratic just because of somehow packets travel within networks. It may sound crazy, but that's the dominant ideology. So the bigger point I think that we need to be aware of is that we cannot just assume cyber enthusiasm or cyber fatalism, whatever we want to call it. We actually have to think through all of these implications because, being enthusiastic in part allows companies like Facebook and Google and all of those private sector technologies I described to do whatever they do now and do that without even thinking about how their own technologies are being used in contexts like China, Russia, Iran. So I'll stop here and I hope we'll continue in the Q&A. Thanks.
Mr. Shirky?
Don't have so many slides. I'll use a couple of them. Here, where's my microphone? I will use a couple of them to make graphic points. No, whatever. I'll hope you can hear me. I want to start by, although I will take the affirmative for the hypothesis before us, I want to start with agreeing with Evgeny about a couple of key points. First of all, I am more pessimistic about this subject than I was a year ago, in part because of conversing with Evgeny. I come to political theory from social media, not vice versa. And the easiest thing to see is what I've been calling recently the theater of collapse, which is to say large groups of people turning out to the street mobilized using these tools. The canonical example was the ouster of Estrada in the Philippines in 2000 using SMS. There were subsequent examples. Aznar's PPP party losing in Spain in 2004, the ouster of the Moldovan communists in 2009. But there are also many failed examples of this. The Lukashenko government stole the election in Belarus in 2006. People turning out in Minsk did not overturn that government. Famously, the Green Wave. More recently, Thai Rak Thai, the so-called red shirts in Thailand. I also want to agree with Evgeny that this conversation isn't so much about a conversation about the internet per se. It is a conversation essentially about the internet's effects on a series of larger non-technological forces. So with that, let me nevertheless take the yes part of the question. The question before us is the internet a democratizing technology? There is an obvious way in which the answer to that question is yes, and Evgeny already prefigured that in his talk as well, which is when we use the word democratizing to mean increased popular access. So what the internet democratizes in its normal form, and I include in this also the use of mobile phones and applications built on top of them as well. So it democratizes access to information. It democratizes citizen ability to speak in public, and it democratizes the ability to coordinate group efforts. So in an American context, roughly, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and freedom of assembly. There's also an obvious and tautological way in which the answer to that question is no. When we use the word democratization to mean a political form of government in which the adult citizens of a country can reliably have disputed elections in which they change their leaders, the internet isn't a political system, and I think Evgeny's point about you can't just analyze the internet full stop and see what the nodes are doing in a complex system like politics. So when you were talking about the internet democratization, you were in part talking about democracy. I want to adopt a definition of democracy. This is taken from Robert Dahl, who is a scholar of democracy. He works down the road at the New Haven Community College. And he has 7 points. I will not read them to you. You're perfectly capable of reading them to yourself. He has 7 points he believes need to be in place for a system of government to be called a democracy. And what you'll notice here is that the first 4 points there are about a political system with reliable disputed elections among broadly all of the adults in a country. And that the bottom 3 are communicative instead, are essentially about citizens' ability to inform, to discuss, and to coordinate. And when I approach the question, is the internet a democratizing technology? My way of framing that question is, to what degree does B affect A? Which is to say, to what degree do communicative freedoms affect political freedoms? So I want to offer three arguments for that relationship being both present and positive in the current environment. They are empirical, historical, and observational. Let's start with the empirical evidence. If there were strong empirical evidence, I could stand up here and be done in 5 minutes. Alas for you, there is not, so I won't be. What there have been is a handful of studies recently with relatively large N. Jacob Groshek at the University of Iowa indexed the diffusion of internet in a country with the country's democracy level for all years looked at in the period between 97 and 2003. You can see here from the trend line, very strong correlation, not causal, very strong correlation between internet diffusion and democracy. I think a way in which Evgeny and I might frame the disagreement between us is you will see especially the line in the middle there, the line of dots in the middle there, where there are a handful of countries that achieved relatively high internet diffusion but relatively low levels of democracy. One of the open questions is, are those countries outliers or are they precursors? And I think that might frame the disagreement between Evgeny and I. Philip Howard, more recently in his book, Digital Origins of Dictatorship and Democracy, has taken essentially the lower left-hand corner of that graph and looked at it with a broader range of ICT development. This is all majority or significantly Muslim countries, indexed again to diffusion of social media and the democracy index. Again, there is a slight move here up and to the right. Howard spent more time trying to isolate this as a causal as opposed to a merely correlative effect. However, the empirical evidence is still weak. I think the best we can say for the empirical evidence at this point is that social media may help in the long run, and it does not seem to offer disconfirming evidence of the hypothesis. Second argument is historical. And this is essentially, under what circumstances would we expect, and under what circumstances have we seen media have a positive effect on democracy? The famous case there is obviously the printing press. You could adopt as a topic sentence for that thesis: the French Revolution would not have been possible without the printing press. And this line of thought first picked up by the German philosopher Jürgen Habermas, who noted that in Paris, in advance of the revolution, there sprung up over 200 newspapers. And those papers were all published by ideological associations, in part because freedom of speech was illegal. So to have a newspaper was essentially already to take a political stance. And as Habermas put it, every newspaper had its organization and every organization had its newspaper. So this was a case where the availability of a communications technology increased both political awareness and increased the ability of groups to coordinate with one another. And Habermas especially emphasizes this effect happened prior to the uprising. It happened prior to the French Revolution. It happened prior to the broad institution of democracy in France, which is to say that communications tools sometimes give populations ways of disciplining elites through the strengthening of civil society in advance of democracy, democracy often being a late step in that. More recently, Paul Starr, the American sociologist and author of The Creation of the Media, the book on the American media landscape, noted that the American Revolution would not have been possible without the post office. That the post office provided the opportunity both for the committees of correspondence in various different towns in the United States to coordinate political opinion with one another across a dozen colonies without needing a single national press, and that later the post office allowed for the distribution of the Federalist Papers, which was the public working out of the principles that became the Constitution we now live under. This is a communications tool that supports both strong and weak ties. You may have seen Malcolm Gladwell also weighing in this debate recently in the New Yorker in Small Change. Gladwell says quite reasonably, pure weak tie networks, the kind of slacktivism thing you'll see, shout outs for ending world hunger on Facebook, that those kinds of things are at best crowdsourced PR. Certainly true. What isn't true is that, what I think Gladwell suggests that isn't true is that these networks can never be used to support strong ties. In fact, we see both strong tie and weak tie networks adopting these tools wherever they're available. Asa Briggs, essentially a third historian of the media landscape, also brings up the idea of the Dictators Dilemma. He calls it the conservative dilemma. And as against the idea that the internet amplifies all actors, what Briggs suggests in his formulation of the conservative dilemma is that the one thing it denies existing states is the ability to remain completely silent. So Briggs's framing of the conservative dilemma or the dictator's dilemma is that once a state no longer enjoys untrammeled access to the rhetorical sphere, once a state says something that risks there being either a reply or a coordinated reaction, the idea of simply having enforced silence on the part of the population goes away, and the state is then pitched into one of two alternate reactions, which are censorship or propaganda, and Evgeny covered both of those cases. But I think the significant shift in the censorship and propaganda, the arrival of censorship and propaganda, is that both of those are essentially responses to the inability to simply use enforced silence as the norm. And finally, Eli Katz and Paul Lazarsfeld, in studying the politics of mass media in America, set out to figure out how mass media changes public opinion, how in particular television changes people's political opinions around who should be president. And they found, to their astonishment, that it largely doesn't. They believed that the broadcasting of ads on television would correlate with a change in people's opinions shortly after the ads were aired. In fact, what they found is that only those opinions that were re-amplified by people's social networks, whether it was friends or family or colleagues, were internalized. And so in this case, I think although in the US we always have high regard for our own products, I think the emphasis right now within the State Department for access to Google, access to Wikipedia, access to the New York Times as the core concern of the idea of internet freedom as articulated by Secretary Clinton. That is, I believe, the least powerful disciplining force by citizens in a country against the elites of their country. It is much likelier to be from opinions discussed in social networks, some of them broadly public as on sites like Facebook, some of them more private as distributed by SMS or email. But Katz and Lazarsfeld's two-step theory suggests that media which increases the social dynamic of conversation will have a disproportionately large effect on the formation and spread of political opinion. And one place where I would say that the internet is not just a dramatic improvement in cost or access, but is actually offering a new possibility, is in this idea of providing a platform for coordination among large groups. So that historical evidence suggests that the mechanism by which media can democratize and has democratized in the past is the strengthening of the public sphere, not in fact in the rapid excitement of the masses to turn out in the streets and topple the government. There was no recipe for overturning an authoritarian regime prior to the internet. There is no recipe for overturning an authoritarian regime today with the internet. On the other hand, what we see is that surveillance states have not always been as effective as they as we might think they are. The example of the Stasi, of course, prior to the current age, the most effective, most intrusive surveillance state that the world had seen, the Stasi had an enormous investment in spying on its citizens. Romania merely had a brutal and vicious dictator and the willingness to attack its own citizens. And yet when the end came for communism in Eastern Europe, Romania lasted longer than the GDR. The GDR went away first and Romania went last. So in many cases, we may be looking at something that is indexed less to surveillance than the willingness of the state to kill its own citizens in an attempt to keep political power. That suggests that the strengthening of the public sphere in advance of political change and the strengthening of the public sphere as a way other than voting to allow citizens to begin to discipline the elites who run their lives becomes the mechanism, certainly in the past, becomes the mechanism by which media has democratized countries in the past. So it brings me to the third part of the argument, which is observational evidence. As Evgeny said, and as I alluded to at the beginning, the pro versus con debate for dramatic public turning out in the street, typically by the youth, typically in the central city, is inconclusive. It has sometimes worked, it has sometimes not worked, just as prior to the internet. And so there's no reason to think that that mechanism is the primary mechanism here. What the failure of the theater of collapse in the cases where it has failed, Belarus in 2006, Tehran last year, Minsk 2006, Tehran last year, Bangkok this year, would make us conclude, I think, that the dramatic turning out in the street isn't a replacement for a long process. It's just something that appears at the end of the long process. When collapse comes, it's not something that is accelerated by these tools. What I think we can start to see is the conservative dilemma appearing in the strengthening of civil society outside of this kind of mobilization. So, as an example, in 2006, a PDF appeared taken from snapshots of Google Earth of Bahrain. And it was page after page of blistering political commentary about the Bahraini royal family taking over land that was nominally to be held in the public trust. Bahrain, in turn, said, well, if that's Google Earth, then we're shutting off access to Google Earth. And suddenly people in Bahrain who wanted to use Google Earth to plan hiking trips and what have you were told they could no longer get access to it. And when they tried to find out why, they found out it was because of this PDF, to which they said, what PDF? And suddenly the number of people who knew about both Google Earth and this PDF went up so dramatically that Bahrain was forced to retract this, forced to reopen access. This is an example of what Ethan Zuckerman up at Berkman calls the cute cat theory of internet dissent, which is that tools designed specifically for dissidents are relatively easy to shut down because dissidents almost by definition in the beginning don't have broad popular and certainly don't have governmental support. But that if you use the same tools that people use to distribute cute pictures of their cats and the government shuts it down, you actually risk bringing the broadly apathetic group of citizens, which characterizes every country, whether democracies or autocracies, into awareness of these kinds of things. And so this is again the conservative dilemma or dictator's dilemma, which is that the apathetic consumption of mass media nevertheless provides an environment for potentially politicizing kinds of speech. There was a famous example in 2008 of a protest in Korea after the mad cow, after they were reopening the Korean market to American beef after it had been shut down for mad cow disease, which was a large part of the protest, and many of the protesters were radicalized on a website for Dongbang Shinki, which is not a political group but a boy band. Nevertheless, the presence of a place where 800,000 Koreans could assemble turned out to be a potential site of political conversation. Another example, the green wave plainly has gone at the very least dormant in Iran at the moment, but there have been successful uses of distributed pressure to discipline the Iranian government, the most famous of them being the 1 million signatures campaign, in which Iranian women collected 1 million signatures to pressure the government to remove or not to pass some of the most misogynist laws, both on the books and that were being proposed. And so this is an example, different from the Green Wave, of the strengthening of civil society coordinated in part through the use of these tools that takes place in the public sphere but is not expressly aimed at overthrow of the government. Again, in China, the awful Sichuanese earthquake in May of 2008. In the aftermath of that quake, the general awareness that the construction trades were corrupt suddenly became quite acute because the quake happened during school hours, and the schools were built in substandard ways even though they were in an earthquake-prone zone. When the schools collapsed, they killed many of the children, and because of China's one-child policy, they therefore knocked out a generation, right? There were families suddenly left childless. So the state found itself dealing now with protests, not targeting overthrow, not targeting specific national political change, but from a group of very sympathetic citizens who turned out and organized and published their stories on QQ and other Chinese sites in such numbers that they managed to force an abject public confession from the local officials. The Chinese then freaked out about this, as they would, because they realized that they had a radicalized group that was not also marginalized on their hands for the first time. This is not the Falun Gong. This is not a Uyghur minority. This is not about Tibet. These were ethnic Han Chinese who were in a key Chinese province, who nevertheless were demanding not national change, just an end to local corruption. I think it is far likelier that this is the kind of effect that will force China into increased democratization, rather than any attempt to change the party at the national level. And finally, and this talks to something that's happening in Evgeny's country. Lukashenko, as I noted, stole the election in Belarus in 2006. There was an outpouring in the streets. It was subsequently shut down, and after the shutdown of the protests, the Lukashenko regime also shut down every opposition newspaper, radio site, and television site. Complete control of the classic troika of 20th century media. What Lukashenko has not been able to shut down is Charter 97. You can see that, I don't know if you can see this actually, but this is today's date. And in an eerie repeat of the events of 2006, the opposition, the nominal opposition that Lukashenko defeated 83-17 last time in an obvious show vote, has gotten 100,000 signatures again. So we're now heading into a potential political crisis again in Belarus, covered by Charter 97. There is, of course, strong censorship at the Belarusian border, but the website itself is still up. It is still available, and for people using web proxies, or in some cases, just taking down the information and sending it into the country on paper, some of this is still available. On September 3rd of this year, and this is an event after we'd agreed to this debate, but has happened in the interim, Ala Bayabenin, the founder of Charter 97 and the operator of the website, was found hanged in a spot where he was vacationing. It was originally claimed that he'd been in a night of serious drinking and then committed suicide. After some pressure, the police have admitted, yes, it could be murder. There is a nominal and probably inconclusive inquest. It is widely believed, for the obvious reason, that this was that Bayabenin was done in by the state. And I would hold this up as the best observational reason, not just this example, but this kind of example, for believing that the internet is a democratizing technology, which is that both the dissidents and the governments of the world believe that it is and are taking steps to react. Certainly, if there are digital reactions on the part of the state in terms of censorship or redirecting people towards and away from digital propaganda, that is something that's going on within the digital sphere and needs to be addressed. But examples like this show that there are places where the state doesn't have a digital response. Right? The state essentially has to exit the debate between censorship and propaganda. And even autocratic regimes don't murder their citizens lightly. So the fact that this is something that both the dissidents and the governments of the world are willing to fight over at this to this degree suggests to me that the internet is a democratizing technology. So my answer my answer to the hypothesis is yes, with 3 caveats. The internet is a democratizing technology if we look at it as a source of slow development of civil society in the public sphere, with the ability of citizens to coordinate with one another, to speak their mind, even under conditions of some of state restraint. This may be the biggest source of disagreement between Evgeny and I. I believe that the Dictators Dilemma is real. I don't believe that the internet amplifies all choices. In fact, I think one of the choices it removes is essentially total control of the rhetorical environment. 2, the democratizing effects, even over the long term, are not monotonic, which is to say it is possible for states to exit this change. States that have extractive economies will have an easier time of doing that than states that have industrial economies. If you get your money out of the ground in the form of oil or platinum or diamonds, or even as a mainly agrarian country, it is easier to keep these technologies at bay than if you need to run an industrialized economy. And third, and this may be one of the biggest sources of agreement between Evgeny and I, one way in which this could be reversed is that we are living through the first time in history where the public sphere on a global scale is almost entirely privately owned. And that is new. In the United States, we know this is a series of decisions about the ability of Vietnam War protesters to operate in shopping malls, which has come up with a kind of middle zone of free speech rights in privately owned public space. But there has so far been no attempt to apply those rulings to, e.g., Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, even locally in the US, much less globally. And I think the place, so the question I always ask myself when standing up here and arguing in favor of something is, what would it look like if I were wrong? And I think what it would look like if I were wrong is a world in which Facebook, Google, et cetera, essentially abdicated any responsibility for support of the public sphere, and in which the world's governments provided no constraints in that direction. So there I'll end. Thank you very much.
Up here. It is now time to open the floor to student questions. Again, I would ask that if you want to be considered for the Hardball Award, you state your first and last name, and beware of the Softball Award. Does anybody want to go ahead and start? Are you all weak of heart?
You've terrified them with the softball.
I know. I'm sorry.
Can I ask Evgeny a question while we're waiting?
Absolutely.
And he may ask me the same question or a different one.
I hope you're not eligible for the Hardball Award.
No. I already said my name, but I'm not eligible for the Hardball Award. No, it's a question I've asked you before, and it's particularly around this idea of internet freedom, which
Sure.
the Secretary of State made a long speech about in January, and you alluded to internet freedom as being not a simple, not a simple thing to implement. So the question, as I've asked you before, is if you were Clinton, what would you do, given the difficulties you've surfaced?
To me, the question here is really how do you want to go about integrating a technology like the internet into the highly ineffective and bureaucratic entity like the State Department. So one way to go about it is to centralize all decision-making under a group of digerati who know everything about the internet and who know everything about Silicon Valley, but they just don't know much about China or Iran or world politics. Another way to go about it is to basically disperse all that decision-making power across regional desks or topical desks, and to try to empower people working on democracy in Russia or democracy in Iran with some decision-making power about the internet. The problem we end up with now is that this urge to promote internet freedom gives this false impression that there is a genuinely new pillar to US foreign policy, and that it's actually possible to have a new pillar to US foreign policy, which is highly idealistic, without reconsidering all the other policies and without reconsidering all the other pillars. I mean, my very cynical Eastern European take on this is that there is no way that there will be a separate internet freedom policy on Azerbaijan where everything the United States does in terms of Azeri policy is driven by energy interests and energy supplies. I mean, there is no way that there will be a genuine support of bloggers, even if Hillary Clinton ends up making a lot of big speeches about defending Azeri bloggers. What I don't want is to establish a new metric of internet freedom, which will be completely meaningless and completely separated from the other metric of human rights and, you know, freedom of expression in general. Of course, the Azeri government will first imprison an Azeri blogger. The following day, when Clinton visits, they will release him or her, and they will score high points on internet freedom. But, you know, the newspapers will still be as controlled as they were, and it will not move anywhere. So my overarching point here is that there are choices about how to go about the internet. You know, any bureaucracy faces those choices. And the choices that have been made so far was, and I'll give some context because you may not understand what I mean by digitality. I mean, there are desks in the State Department which now deal with nothing but innovation and internet freedom. Those are brand new offices whose job is basically, you know, to follow the advice opposite to the one I gave in my PowerPoint. They look onto the internet, find some internal logic to it, and then try to reshape the world in accordance to that logic, which I think is highly utopian and will probably cause a lot of trouble.
Mr. Morozov, do you have a question for Mr. Shirky?
Not off the top of my head. I can ask you many questions I've asked you before, just like you did. If there are any from the audience, we can take those. If not, I
Yes,
can think of
please.
some.
So, is this on? I don't
We
know.
can
Okay, it
hear
doesn't
you.
matter. What about the idea
Your name?
that say, what?
Your name for the hardball award.
Oh, can I not be
Can we
eligible?
score the
You
questions?
don't have to be eligible.
Okay.
Go ahead.
What about the idea that, say, the internet allows really extreme voices to be heard and they drown out all the moderate voices? And then this basically means that politics caters to the extremist ends. Would that be like, say, democratizing or undemocratizing in either speaker's opinion?
I'll take that as an undemocratizing force. I think we've seen that in this country most dramatically with the launch of Change.gov right after Obama's election, in which the idea came across, let's put a political memo on Obama's desk, and the American people, when asked, said during 2 wars and the biggest financial meltdown in U.S. history, that the most important issue facing the country was the legalization of medical marijuana. It was the #1 issue. It was 7 of the top 10. It was 16 of the top 50. And that was an example of pure factionalization. Now, the irony is that the greatest political philosopher the U.S. has ever produced, in my opinion, James Madison, author of the Federalist Papers I alluded to earlier, specifically laid out a design of the Constitution that would prevent those extremist voices by saying, essentially, the government is not there to be hijacked by faction. The government is there to essentially be the place where faction contends. So to the degree that we say unfettered anonymous access to a rhetorical environment is an absolute, you know, essentially the absolute normal case of speech, we will get a rhetorical tragedy that comes. What's interesting to me now is that there are a number of places which have essentially found either isometric ways to handle this problem, as with Wikipedia talk pages, or have found essentially high-cost participation ways of doing it, as with Stack Overflow and Stack Exchange. So I think that as in the real world, the design of democratic conversation is not the same as unfettered freedom for all factions to rant as loudly as they can, but rather ways of bringing that conversation into a more structured environment.
And my very short comment here is that, you know, I'm concerned with how politicians will be reacting to all of that, because I do feel that some of those groups are much better positioned to exert disproportional influence on many politicians. And, you know, the basic question is, you know, when it's so easy to follow, who'll have the courage to lead? And then I think when you look at Twitter and Facebook and other forums through which you can now exert pressure on politicians, and this pressure is exerted by groups which are, very non-transparent and sometimes undemocratic. I mean, the critique of the public sphere, I think, here of the new digital public sphere is very long overdue because, yes, it is extremely decentralizing. It is extremely decentralized, which means that anyone can, play a role in shaping it. But if you have some resources, you can actually exert much more influence on the overall direction of the conversations. You can go, I don't know if you saw, there is this new internet documentary called AstroTurf Wars, which basically shows you how various political movements in this country are taking advantage of this decentralized nature of the public sphere. But when you tell people to go to Amazon and look for blogs of their ideological opponents and then just give all of them 1 star without ever reading them, I mean, that just shows you, how easy it is to exert at least some pressure on the direction of the public conversation. And the fact that it's decentralized in no way implies or means that it's more democratic or it's less susceptible to manipulation. That was actually the whole point of Habermas's critique of the public sphere in the 20th century, but we can sort of leave Habermas alone.
Next question.
My name is Anish Sarma. My question is actually very closely related to the previous question. And I guess I'm more interested with this question in the democratizing effects of the internet potentially domestically as opposed to in other countries. So we've seen in the history of this country that small, organized, focused minority groups can sometimes exert disproportionate influence on policymaking because they have higher voter turnout and they'll call the congressman until he can't do anything else or whatever other tactics will focus them on their one issue. And I'm wondering if you can think of examples in recent history of the internet being used to create that kind of organization potentially in non-minority groups, or if you think there is potential for a democratizing effect in that way of people who are not necessarily going to organize in other spheres, organizing on the internet. Is that all clear?
Well, so those strike me as two different kinds of things. First of all, I don't believe there's anything local to U.S. politics to say that small, intensely passionate factions have a different kind of effect than large, than the large agreements of the polity. And in fact, I think that in a way the mass of the population almost doesn't need to be politically represented in that way because they're represented by the way the world currently works, which is to say, essentially, the mechanism of democracy is almost always to favor, or democracy when it actually counterbalances power, almost always favors insurgency in the early days of an insurgency. That's a feature and not a bug in my view. I would say right now, although I disagree with their politics, that the Tea Party is making the most dramatically interesting use of these tools. It may be, to Evgeny's point about if there are enough followers who will lead, that what's been created for the insurgency, the tools being used by the insurgency can't be used by people in power. Right? All we know now is that Obama didn't govern the way he campaigned. We haven't yet seen whether he could have or not. We will see when the Tea Party comes into power how disappointed their supporters are about the difference between Tea Party conference calls and meetups in advance of them becoming congresspeople or governors, and what happens after that. So what I would say is that the important design principle isn't, I think, passionate majority use of these tools. Passionate majorities are almost oxymoronic in democracies. Instead, I would say it is about the kind of pro and con tension between different factions. Amazon, in order to combat the problem that Evgeny just noted, has added the sort of "was this review useful to you" metric as a way of sort of trying to broker some of the partisan tension. So I think that it's not. I think we're not.
So you'll have to click twice now.
You have to click twice now. That's right. And it raises the cost enough. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't automatically show you the 1-star reviews, the most partisan 1-star reviews. And so you get some rhetorical space to have a middling conversation. So I think what we're going to see is much more the design of factional balance than we're going to see passionate majority use of these tools.
I'd just like to very quickly clarify what I meant when I said that, who will lead when it's so easy to follow. What I meant is that, in a sense, pandering to, various pressure groups and, voters or, whatever audiences you want to think of is, in a sense, very easy, but also almost inevitable these days. I mean, with the wealth of data, it's not just polling data now. Now you can go and data mine Facebook and Twitter for sentiment analysis and analyze the way that the public is likely to react to any issue in any locality, on any level of, it can be something in your neighbor's backyard, and you already have a poll of people, expressing their opinions on Twitter. And, the question then is, where does leadership come from? And where does leadership come from when, especially, so many of these campaigns happen so fast and incomplete evidence? You had this big case a few months ago with this official at the Department of Agriculture being fired over, video which was not properly edited, with the government, as it now appears, overreacting without ever seeing, the complete version. So, and why did that happen? Because, of course, they were scared that the backlash that would trigger on the internet will then engulf the rest of the administration. So there is definitely this element of pandering, which I find very disturbing. And, that I think is very problematic democracy-wise. But
We'll take the next question. And Mr. Shirky, you warned me when we started this conversation that both of you answer questions in paragraphs. We find this to be true, and because we have such a long line, I'm going to ask you to keep it a little bit more brief. Yes.
Roger that.
we'll do tweets.
Just tweet your answer, and you guys can read it.
Again, this question isn't really specifically meant for either of you, I think, but isn't there another effect of the internet that it kind of depoliticizes people? Since, people, first of all, people have so much irrelevant information in terms of politics, just like what their neighbor is doing, just all the little details of other people's lives that are, that they're so concerned, they end up being so concerned with these little details and much less concerned about big, big information about politics. And then second, since there's all this information coming from all sorts of different sources that is difficult, it's difficult to say that it's reliable. And so people might have also be depoliticized because they have a certain cynicism about the information that they read. They're not sure about how, how reliable it is, and so they can't really feel that they have the right to form an opinion because of that.
So I lived through the 1980s, and it was no paradise in terms of politics. So don't create a golden age in which a previously politically engaged American citizenry has somehow been distracted by lolcats and tweets. In fact, we're seeing a rise of participation in elections in this country after a long period of decline that correlated much more with the spread of cable television than with the spread of the internet. The second is that the second. I'm not sure whether the first effect you named that I don't think you could actually find that. The second effect, on the other hand, is true. People are much more wary about information. Right, the days when Walter Cronkite and his two clones strode the earth and were the sole source of political information available to Americans of an evening was the absolute high watermark in trust of the press. It was also the low watermark in terms of the number of opinions and the political diversity of those opinions people were getting. So one of the reasons people are confused is that politics is confusing. Right? And so when it would be inconceivable for the current gay marriage debate to have played out in the way it is played out were there still only 3 broadcast networks. So I would say that yes, the upset and confusion over the lack of visibly correct, broadly agreed to evidence is real, but I would say that's in part because a lot of what we used to regard as objectivity was actually mainstream intersubjective agreement, and that has now gone away.
May I still? Yeah. So on the first point, there is actually some interesting evidence in the context of authoritarian states with regards to whether information in general, information technology in general actually politicizes or depoliticizes. An example I often use is Germany, actually, during the communist rule. There was an interesting part of West Germany, pretty much almost fifth-sixth of its territory. They could actually receive Western broadcasting. So they could actually receive all the media coming from West Germany, which meant that, and the state wasn't blocking it for various reasons, one of which I guess was strategic. They knew it was distracting. But so the East Germans could actually receive both Western broadcasting, all the soap operas, all the American soap operas and the like, and East German broadcasting, all the boring East German, propaganda and the like. And what basically happened is that instead of tuning in to political news and learning about NATO and how terrible the Soviet Union was, these Germans mostly tuned into soap operas and tuned in mostly to entertainment. Actually, political news was the least watched part of their information diet. And the moment as German officials realized that, they even allowed people to keep the satellites and to keep the antennas and to continue receiving the Western signal. So I mean, there is definitely a role which is very hedonistic, which does make many of those people who otherwise live very not boring, but it's very tough to live in a place like Iran or China or even Russia these days without some kind of a release valve. So I mean, the internet does provide that space, and whether it makes you more politicized or not, I would venture that for many people, particularly the young people, for whom the choice is either getting drunk or going and standing up with some political slogan in front of the mayor's office, or staying home and watching YouTube. I mean, I would assume many would choose YouTube and forgo all the pleasures or unpleasures that will come with two other choices. So I think you definitely have a point there.
Thank you. Next question.
Hi, my name is Jesse Towson. Mr. Shirky, you talked about the sort of historical evolution of democratizing media from the printing press, and I assume that argument can be brought through more recent media. And so I'm wondering, do you see the internet as just the next step in this evolution of democratizing media, or is there some sort of second order change in which the internet has fundamentally changed the public sphere?
Well, so that's a very interesting question. First of all, I would say that the democratizing media tends to have the characteristic that it democratizes not just consumption, but also production. So printing press, phone, fax, telephone, more than radio and television. The internet, plainly another in a line there. I don't like the question of fundamentals because I don't believe in essences. Which is to say, one of the things we know from systems theory is that the distinction between a difference in degree and a difference in kind doesn't exist. Very large, very fast, very integrated systems behave differently than the same systems in the small. So when the internet was 4 nodes and very predictable, in 1969, there's an unbroken line from that network to this one, but this network is a different kind of network from that one. So what I would say, to make the maximum case for the novelty of effects, is the geographic reach, right? The fact that Charter 97, for instance, can host itself in Washington, D.C., and therefore, unlike all of the other 20th century media, media in the 20th century, not removable online. And 2, the ability to associate very large groups in loose conversational units, not just overlapping broadcast, but actually something where there is super distribution, where there is flow, and where there is synchronizing conversation, what the military calls situational awareness. So I wouldn't make an argument that is root and branch different from the things that have gone before. Plainly, the printing press also had synchronizing effects. But I would say that the speed, scale, and as Evgeny flagged, the low cost do make these effects more than just a simple linear addition on what's gone before.
Take the next question.
I'm Allegra Pincus, and my question is for Mr. Morozov. I think most people would say pretty confidently that transparency is a fundamental aspect of liberal democracy. And recently in the news, there's been this organization called WikiLeaks. And I'm asking you if you think an organization like WikiLeaks could exist without the internet, given that the internet has, if not unique, then at least it's a difference in degree and not kind of being, you know, almost rendering geography obsolete, decreasing distribution costs, and having such a limited hierarchy that it ensures a kind of anonymity. So I was wondering, do you think it could exist without the internet? Or do you think it's not important?
Well, the short answer is that no, I don't think it could exist without the internet, but to give you sort of half a paragraph answer.
140 characters.
All right.
please.
So, I mean, yes, transparency very important. You know, there is the famous quote which is overused all the time that, you know, sunshine is the best disinfectant. The problem is that when people use that quote, no one talks about sunburn or, you know, skin cancer. And, you know, my response to that quote always says, what's the sunscreen? You know, sure, you know, sunshine is great, but and transparency is great. But, you know, a normally functioning liberal democracy probably requires some limit as to how much transparency is actually desirable, in part because that's how societies function, you know, and that's how democratic societies function, and that's how representative democracy functions. You know, if you want to know everything about your representative, and if you want to control every single vote he casts, well, maybe we have to move to a different political system, which will not leave any autonomy to elected representatives, and we'll just vote on Twitter or Facebook, right? So the question of transparency, I think, is very important, and I think it's extremely under-theorized in the context of the internet. And most of the guys who are talking about the power of the internet, they do not necessarily come from political theory project at Brown, so they do not always see all the complexities that are involved. So for them, more transparency is always good, and they think that 100% transparency is the best possible thing that can happen. The problem is that you do run into problems with, you know, I'll give you one example. So in Japan, there is this social kind of outcast minority called burakumin, and those are people who've been living on the margins of the Japanese society for a few centuries, and they lived in particular parts of you know, cities, and no one actually, well, very few people kind of, I mean, those who didn't like them knew where they were, but they wouldn't go and interfere with them. Now someone is basically taking the census data about those burakumin minorities and actually uploading them to Google Maps and specifying where those people live and calling them names, which, of course, from the perspective of liberal democracy may not necessarily be such a great thing, because, you know, we do want some tolerance and we do want some limits. And, you know, that's happening in many other places and societies. In terms of WikiLeaks, I mean, they do play an important function. It's just that they don't practice what they preach. Internally, you know, there is very little transparency about WikiLeaks itself, and I think until they find a way to reconcile their rhetoric with their internal structure, you know, and find out ways in which they can actually govern themselves effectively, because they do present themselves as speaking on behalf of the world civilization. It's just that they're not accountable to anyone. So finding ways to build that accountability in will strengthen their credibility. You know, at this point, I think they have put themselves in such a difficult position that that may no longer be possible for various political and publicity reasons. But I'm sure Clay will have something to add here as well.
All I'd add to keep my tweet down is to echo Evgeny, the famous case of the Dutch census from the 1930s, which noted where all the Jews were in order to better administer the town, when it fell into Nazi hands, became a document whose legibility was suddenly used to obviously horrifying ends. So I would say that one of the critiques, and I've made this elsewhere as Evgeny, is that transparency is a midpoint and not an end point. There are a number of essentially database-driven theorists who think, and then the data was set free, and that's always the end of the sentence. But in fact, the integration of what legible data is, including the fact that all of us as citizens desire that a bunch of our data not become legible, is an important counter-disciplining force and not currently well reflected in that debate.
I think that was a challenge, Professor Tomasi, if you didn't catch that. I'll take the next couple of questions, but I ask both askers and answerers
Yeah,
to keep it short, please, because it seems you all found your courage.
Sure. My name is Chaney Harrison. I want to thank you both for coming out and presenting today. We heard two diverse sort of presentations of the idea that seemed to hinge on particular definitions of democratization. One that defined it as sort of a transition to political structure, another that sort of defined it as a increase in particular freedoms, information, communication, mobility. I'd like to ask both speakers, how do you justify the particular definition of democratization that you chose to present today?
I justify mine in the simplest way, which is that I picked the scholars of democracy who I think, who in my reading have gotten it right. Dahl, in particular, I think balances both of the things you said, which is both the communicative freedoms and the political structure. And so what I look to that definition to help figure out is how to balance that. There are a variety of other available definitions, but they all cover broadly the points that Dahl did. So I picked essentially the scholarly view that seemed to me to be relatively close to a consensus among democratic theorists.
Mm-hmm. And I played the trick, as you see, I didn't actually define what I meant by democratization. In part because I think it's like that other famous quote about pornography that we know it when we see it. It's very hard to talk about democratization when you try to bridge sort of the discourse about liberal democracies and then what's happening in authoritarian states. In part because, all right, so now more Russians can tweet. I mean, what does it mean in terms of, political processes happening in Russia? I think the problem with much of our understanding of authoritarian states so far is that we have assumed that this political structures that govern them do not want to change. So we assume that any change that they're forced to make is somehow a good thing for democracy. It reminds me, sorry, I'm kind of doing a lot of quotes and jokes, but it reminds me of this bad joke of, when someone asks how many psychoanalysts it takes to change a light bulb. And it takes just one, but the light bulb really needs to want to change. The point is that if the Chinese do know that they need to adapt their political system to be more responsive to globalization, and if the Russians know that, the fact that they're changing under the pressure of the internet does not necessarily mean that, they are having any less power to govern the citizens, so that, the bureaucrats are somehow becoming less effective. And I think, like, the jury is still out on what counts as democratization under the conditions of globalization. Yes, some of the ties will be weakening, the government's ability to do things will be weakening. It doesn't mean that they will hold less power as a result. So I just don't want to put myself into any rigid theoretical framework.
It seems like it's hard to defend it as yes or no if you can't provide a definition.
But I think the question itself is wrong, because the question should not be about the internet. The question should focus on the actually in my book I end up criticizing the view which I dubbed internet centrism. And that this recent tendency to frame every single question and issue through the lens of the internet. And like in this particular case, I think it actually harms. If you look at it from the policy-making perspective, like there is nothing that framing this question in terms of the internet actually gives to the policymaker. Sure.
Hi, my name is Max Kirsch. Mr. Shirky, you talk in your book Cognitive Surplus, partially about how with social media it gives everybody a chance to click publish, basically. Mm-hmm. And so I'm wondering, for both of you, to what extent do you think that that internet is democratizing in the sense that it allows people to find their own voice and empowers them to question?
I would say essentially it is tautologically democratizing in the sense that when you have it, you have more access to this capability. To the degree that then leads to significant mental change or attitudes towards political or social structures, that's not tautological, which is to say, it is always the case that there is a minority of people who care about political issues. It is only in very rare circumstances that the broad public will suddenly get engaged, and very often those are regarded in the life of the country as moments of crisis. So to the first book, Here Comes Everybody, the example of Alisar Chirapunxe, it was a Thai blogger who ended up covering the Thai coup because the Thai military shut down the local media, but she had a cell phone and a blog and just took pictures of tanks in front of Government House. That certainly ended up turning her more into someone who thinks more about politics, and she now, funnily enough, works as a consultant for the State Department. But the act of radicalization wasn't the act of her having a blog, which mostly covered fashion trends in Bangkok nightclubs. It was of having committed an act of journalism at a key moment. So I don't believe that the tautological sense of access to public voice automatically translates to politicization. The best it does is provides an opportunity when that opportunity presents itself.
Mr.
I agree.
No? All right, next question.
You've both obviously been asked to come here and take either sides on this question of is the internet a democratizing technology? I think that you both also are kind of coming to the same point, which is that it's just a tool, and it's a tool being used by both sides in one way or another. And I would submit that perhaps the effect on those who are both in favor of and against democratization is that the internet is an amplifying technology, that it makes things happen louder and it makes them happen faster. Whether that means you want to clamp down on protests and find out who they are faster, or you want to get your message out. And I guess the only other impact that it has is that it means the story gets out there into the mainstream media in other countries much faster as a result as well.
I would say if you wanted to maximize, I mean, first of all, I think I will say from my point of view that this convergence is true, and it's true in part because I've been reading Evgeny and have moved away from the theater of collapse. Right, when I started, because I was interested just in places where social coordination tools change public action, full stop. Those examples were things I talked about. But when I was asked to speak not on that capability but on statecraft full stop, I had to take into account the state's counterreaction. So I've certainly moved in that direction. That having been said, I think if you wanted to draw, from my point of view, if you wanted to draw the strongest line you could between our 2 points of view, the moment I flagged in Evgeny's talk was this idea of amplification and the idea that it amplifies all actors. And that's something that I don't believe, and in part because I think I believe in the Dictators Dilemma, which is the one thing it can't amplify is the state's putative rhetorical control while participating in such a network. So the only strategy then becomes essentially exiting the network in some way or other. And so that, if from my side of the debate, I would say it is really about the amount of distortion that comes with that amplification. If it was just the 20th century amped up, we would be looking at essentially faster movements of familiar dynamics. I think the presence of unfamiliar dynamics comes because some of the amplifications are leading and some are lagging. And I'm expecting over a long period for those leads and lags to actually reshape world culture.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'd like to clarify, first of all, when I talk about amplification, and I did point it out in the slides, is that the changes that happen as a result of the amplification may actually shift the overall balance. So some forces will get empowered proportionally more than others. So while the absolute pie chart pie is growing, the relative shares may actually be increasing or decreasing. Again, and this, I guess, does show where we disagree. For once, I don't think that there was any rhetorical monopoly that governments had on many of these discourses. Even if you look, I actually did look at the reaction of the Soviet leaders in the 60s to the appearance, and 70s to the appearance of Samizdat. Many of them chose not to block it, and they said, we just don't have the capacity to block it. Let's just, have it flow. Does it mean that Samizdat undermined and killed the Soviet Union? I don't think so. Does it mean that the Soviet Union may still, be with us if there was no Samizdat? I don't know. Again, there is a lot of, mobilization of historical analogies where we don't even have a good grasp on the archives yet, to make any deliberate, Romania did have a very powerful Securitate, which was probably more powerful than Stasi. They did check, they actually almost asked every Romanian to submit a handwritten sample so they can analyze the letters that Romanians were sending to Radio Free Europe to identify who wrote them. in addition to having Romanians register every typewriter. So again, whether you believe in Dictators Dilemma, I guess, depends on how deep you want to look into this. I mean, in addition to censorship, even with Charter 97, what Clay didn't mention is that now they are one of the most leading attractors, so to say, of cyber attacks. They are actually unavailable probably 1 week out of 4 because there are powerful denial of service attacks, which basically make them unavailable globally, not just in Belarus. So there are ways in which governments can crack down on those projects. And again, the fact that governments are cracking down on them does not mean that they play any meaningful role in the politics of their countries. My impression with Charter 97 was that, and that's some of the reaction I've been reading, in the Belarusian media and the internet, is that there was no good reason for the government to crack down because they appealed to 3 or 5 at most % of the audience, and even that would probably be overblown. In addition to that, they're not a grassroots entity with 5 people sitting in the basement. They receive more funding from Washington than probably all of the independent media put together. It's a very impressive effort, well funded by American government and other governments. So again, you have to bring in all of those regional complexities because otherwise you end up drawing the wrong lessons that the internet overpowers people, and people can suddenly broadcast things they couldn't broadcast before, while you're overlooking the powerful power structures that are actually behind all of those actors and people and entities.
See if we can get through this last question in about 1 minute, and you're all invited to join us in the back of the room with the speakers for some refreshments.
All right, my name is Benjamin. It seems like we've got this assumption that in democratic societies there's equal access to the internet. So just quickly, what are your thoughts on net neutrality? Do you think that Congress should pass a net neutrality act that guarantees equal access and would prevent ISPs from limiting bandwidth or charging for additional usage of bandwidth? And if they don't, is there a danger that the internet just becomes a big cable television with 10,000 channels as opposed to 200 or 300?
I mean, there's certainly a danger of that. There's no business model more attractive than monopoly rent extraction, which is to say earning new dollars for no new value created. I first of all don't assume equal access. I mean, certainly, when you look at statistics by age, race, income, you find fairly dramatic differences. That having been said, I do believe that the principle of not discriminating by either source or mode of carriage, which we have enforced on the post office and the telephone companies, both public, which is to say both public and private entities, I believe should also be enforced on the internet. Because those principles are completely in line with the First Amendment, and to allow those principles to essentially fall out in order to benefit commercial actors would, I think, be a political, would be a terrible political move.
I fully agree with Clay. I just would like to add kind of a funny footnote / anecdote to this. The way in which politicians in Washington working on domestic internet policy now frame net neutrality issue, they actually call it internet freedom. You can actually go and look up the legislature, which is now in Congress. It's actually, I think, it's called Internet Freedom Act of 2010 or 2009. The problem is that if they end up losing, and if Congress doesn't pass the legislation, you'll have Iran and China going on the record accusing the US of violating internet freedom. I mean, again, it just shows you how removed many of the strategies in this space, both domestically and internationally, are from each other, and how imperceptive many of the digerati working on these issues in the foreign policy context are of both domestic debates, but also of how those will be interpreted globally.
I want to echo just one other thing, which is one other place where I think, it's terrible that we're ending agreeing on a bunch of stuff. I know you didn't pay to see that, but the South Korean government right now has adopted a real names policy in order to discipline political actors using the South Korean blogosphere. And if the U.S. does not remonstrate with South Korea as fully as the secretary did against Egypt in her speech, or that we do, rhetorically against Iran on a daily basis, we also undermine our own legitimacy in this space. This gets back to what Evgeny was saying about Azeri bloggers. So I think that the consistent application of the deepest constitutional beliefs about freedom of speech get undermined, if they get significantly undermined in this part of the debate, we all lose a significant amount of leverage and value.
With that, please join me in thanking our speakers and join us in the back.
Thank you guys for coming.